How Russia became the world's biggest country. Of the 195 countries that make up the world today, none is quite as immense, as imposing, or as geographically overwhelming as Russia. It is a nation that seems to stretch beyond the limits of imagination. A colossal expanse of forests, rivers, mountains, frozen tundra, and rolling steppe, spanning a staggering 5,600 miles from the small western enclave of Kaliningrad, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, all the way to the lonely cliffs of Big Diomede Island in the Far East, just across the waters from Alaska. Russia encompasses 11 time zones, a mind-bending detail that almost defies comprehension. To put that into perspective, when people in St. Petersburg are sitting down for breakfast, those in Vladivostok are already finishing their dinner. And while the sun sets on the Baltic coast, it rises again on the shores of the Pacific. In total, Russia covers approximately 6.6 million square miles, so vast that Canada, the second largest nation on Earth, could fit within its borders more than 1.7 times. And this incredible size is not a modern phenomenon. For well over 3 centuries, Russia, one way or another, has maintained its status as the largest country on the planet. At its height in 1866, Russia's territorial reach extended in a breathtaking sweep from the heart of Europe, through the endless interior of Asia, and all the way across the sea into North America, reaching Alaska. Yet astonishingly, just a few centuries earlier, a recognizable Russian state as we know it today did not even exist. Instead, the territory that would one day become Russia was a patchwork of warring tribes, competing principalities, and shifting alliances, a landscape as fractured and unpredictable as the weather that still dominates it. But from this chaos would emerge a nation forged through ambition, survival, conquest, and extraordinary endurance, led by princes, warlords, merchants, Cossacks, and Tsars. This is the story of how Russia became the world's biggest country, geography that shaped a giant. To understand how Russia expanded into the behemoth we recognize today, we must begin not in Siberia, not in the Arctic, and not on the Pacific coast, but in the heart of what historians call European Russia. It is the smaller portion of the country, located west of the Ural Mountains. Though smaller than Siberia, this region has always been the beating heart of Russia's population, culture, and political power. This landscape is dominated by one of the great arteries of the Eurasian continent, the Volga River, the longest river in Europe. Its tributaries cut through plains and forests, linking regions together like natural highways long before railways, motorways, or modern infrastructure. Along this network of waterways stand cities that would become pivotal to Russian identity and strength: Moscow, Kazan, Samara, Volgograd, and Astrakhan. Even today, the Volga isn't just a river. It is a symbol so important in Russian cultural memory that it appears in songs, poems, paintings, and even wartime propaganda. If you travel across these plains, you quickly understand something fundamental. This is a land with few natural barriers. There are no great mountain chains to protect it from invaders, no ocean to shield it, no vast desert to deter conquest. Instead, the territory is open, exposed. Throughout history, that vulnerability would shape Russia's mentality: expand outward or be swallowed from outside. Ancient peoples of the steppe. For centuries before Russia existed, these lands were home to many different groups, shifting across the wide open plains of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a vast stretch between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. In ancient Greek times, the steppe was dominated by the Scythians, mounted warriors famous for archery and speed. Greek writers described them as fierce, nomadic, and seemingly unstoppable, and modern archaeology has confirmed much of their legend through rich burial mounds filled with gold ornaments, weapons, and horses sacrificed to accompany their riders into the afterlife. After them came many others: the Sarmatians, the Huns, and eventually the Goths, whose migrations and invasions would play a role in destabilizing and later transforming the Roman world. The Vikings who went east. When people imagine the Vikings, they tend to think of raiders, storming beaches in England, carving kingdoms into Ireland, or terrorizing monasteries in France. But in truth, the Vikings were not just pirates of the Atlantic. They were also traders, explorers, and settlers in the East. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Scandinavian adventurers crossed the Baltic Sea, sailing into the river systems of Eastern Europe. They traveled down major waterways such as the Volga, the Don, and the Dnieper, pushing into regions that were not only economically promising, but strategically priceless. These rivers were like continental highways of the medieval world. They allowed travelers to move goods from northern forests to southern empires. They reached the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, launching raids on the Byzantine Empire and even striking into territories controlled by the Arab caliphates. Over time, many of these Norsemen began to settle. They established trading posts in early cities, including Novgorod, Kiev, and Staraya Ladoga, ruling them as small city-states. The Norse rulers became known as the Rus, a name that would echo through time, eventually becoming Russia. And gradually, these outsiders assimilated with the local Slavic populations, intermarrying, adopting customs and languages, and creating an emerging hybrid identity. Kievan Rus, the first great Russian state. From these beginnings emerged one of the first major political entities in the region. Kievan Rus, a loose federation of Slavic and Norse-led territories centered on the city of Kiev. Perhaps one of the most important milestones in this period came in 988, when Prince Vladimir the Great adopted Eastern Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium. This single decision shaped the cultural and religious direction of the region for centuries to come. It brought a new alphabetic tradition, new art styles, and a spiritual connection to Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine world. Yet despite its achievements, Kievan Rus was not destined to become the foundation of a unified Russia, because by the early 13th century, a far greater force was gathering strength beyond the horizon. The Mongol storm. In 1223, a terrifying new enemy entered the story: the Mongols. Nomadic horsemen from the heart of Asia, the Mongols had already begun one of the most explosive expansions in human history under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors. At the Battle of the Khalkha River, the Mongols defeated a coalition of Rus principalities and then surprisingly withdrew. But the withdrawal was not mercy, it was reconnaissance. 14 years later, the Mongols returned in full force, and this time they came to conquer. In 1240, the city of Kiev was devastated, razed, burned, and shattered. Much of the southern Rus lands fell under Mongol control and became part of what historians call the Golden Horde. Some northern territories survived by submitting without total destruction, but the Mongol dominance over the region would last for nearly 2 centuries. The Mongols didn't merely conquer with swords and fire. They reshaped politics through tribute, taxation, and authority. They established powerful khanates along the lower stretches of the great rivers like the Volga and Don, including the Golden Horde itself, the Crimean Khanate, and the Kazan Khanate. For the Rus cities and principalities, it meant paying heavy tribute to avoid annihilation, and learning that survival often depended on diplomacy as much as on arms. Rises. By the start of the 15th century, Mongol power across Eurasia began to decline. New empires were rising elsewhere. The Ottomans were growing in the Middle East and southeastern Europe, and the Ming dynasty had taken power in China. In Russia, the rising force was the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Moscow had once been a minor player compared to Kiev or Novgorod, but Moscow had something priceless: a defensible inland location, political ambition, and increasingly capable rulers. Under Ivan III, who ruled from 1462 to 1505, Moscow began expanding aggressively. He fought the Kazan Khanate for control of strategic territory along the Volga. He also conquered Novgorod, a wealthy trading republic tied to the Baltic merchant networks of the Hanseatic League. Novgorod was no ordinary city. It was a medieval powerhouse, a commercial hub, and in many ways a rival civilization. But Moscow absorbed it. Then came Pskov, then Tver. By the start of the 16th century, a centralized Russian state, recognizably Russian in political form, began to take shape. And soon, it would be reshaped even further by one of history's most infamous rulers, Ivan the Terrible, and the birth of Tsarist Russia. In 1547, Ivan IV crowned himself Tsar of all Russia. The word Tsar derived from Caesar, signaling not merely kingship but imperial authority, a statement that Russia would no longer be a collection of principalities, but an empire with divine legitimacy. Ivan IV, remembered as Ivan the Terrible, is one of history's most complex and brutal figures: brilliant, paranoid, deeply religious, and merciless. Yet under his reign, Russia expanded dramatically, particularly southward and eastward. He pushed Russian rule toward the Caspian Sea and, crucially, seized major Tatar strongholds like Kazan and Astrakhan. This wasn't just conquest. This was a transformation of Russia into a multi-ethnic empire. Because once Russia began absorbing Muslim Khanates and non-Slavic peoples, it stopped being merely a Slavic country. It became something bigger, a continental empire. Across the Urals, the conquest of Siberia, now with the Volga secured and rival powers subdued, Russia faced an open horizon. To the east lay the Ural Mountains, not particularly tall compared to the Alps or Himalayas, but symbolically immense, the traditional dividing line between Europe and Asia. Beyond them was Siberia, a land of forests, frozen plains, enormous rivers, and untold resources. And into that wilderness stepped one of the most extraordinary expansion movements in human history. The spearhead of this expansion was not the formal Russian army. It was the Cossacks, semi-nomadic warriors of the steppe, renowned for their toughness, horseback skill, and independence. The Cossacks were both frontier explorers and brutal enforcers. Under leaders such as Yermak Timofeyevich, they conquered the Siberian Khanate, opening the door to a chain reaction of eastward expansion. This wasn't expansion by mass settlement at first. It was expansion by forts. Small wooden stockades, trading posts, outposts, one after another. And the motivation, fur. In Europe and Asia, fur was a luxury industry of staggering value. Sable pelts in particular were so prized they were sometimes referred to as soft gold. Within 100 years, Russian explorers had reached the Pacific Ocean, standing at the shores of the Far East in disbelief at how far they had come. The scale of this is hard to exaggerate. Russia's eastward push across Siberia remains one of the largest land expansions in history. Russia looks beyond the ocean, and then, inevitably, the explorers looked past the Pacific. In the early 18th century, Russia commissioned the Danish explorer and cartographer Vitus Bering to investigate the waters and straits separating Asia from North America. His expedition began in 1733, and the strait would later bear his name, the Bering Strait. In 1741, Bering's crew sighted the coast of Alaska. Though the expedition cost Bering his life, the discovery sparked a wave of fur trappers and adventurers to the region. Slowly, Russia claimed Alaska as an imperial outpost, an extension of Eurasian Russia into North America. For a time, Russia was truly a transcontinental empire, spanning both hemispheres. The westward gaze, Russia and Europe. Despite its dramatic conquest of Siberia, Russia's strategic obsession in the 17th century was not the Far East, it was Europe. Russia needed stronger ties with European commerce and technology, and more than anything, it needed a warm water port. At the time, Sweden dominated much of the Baltic region, controlling Finland and parts of what we now call the Baltic states. Russia relied heavily on the northern port of Arkhangelsk, but Arkhangelsk sits inside the Arctic Circle, and for much of the winter, it was hampered by ice. So Russia did what empires do, it went to war. The Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, became a defining conflict. Under Peter the Great, Russia fought Sweden for dominance, and Peter won. Russia claimed territory around the Gulf of Finland and soon seized what is now parts of Estonia and Latvia. Then Peter built a city, one as symbolic as it was strategic. A new capital on the Baltic Sea, St. Petersburg, named modestly after himself. Peter the Great, modernizing a giant. Peter the Great wasn't only a conqueror, he was a reformer. Earlier in his reign from 1697 to 1698, he embarked on a famous tour of Western Europe, studying shipbuilding, science, engineering, and governance. There's a famous detail that Peter worked in shipyards disguised as a regular laborer. Whether entirely true or embellished, the message was clear. He wanted to learn from the West. And back in Russia, he launched modernization on an astonishing scale, reorganizing the military, modernizing government institutions, introducing European-style dress and court, building a navy from almost nothing. By the time Peter died in 1725, Russia had transformed from an inward-looking medieval empire into one of Europe's great powers. Catherine the Great and the Black Sea Dream. Later, in the late 18th century, another ruler expanded and solidified Russia's imperial momentum, Catherine the Great. Ruling from 1762 to 1796, Catherine pushed Russia southward toward the Black Sea. Russia fought the Ottomans again and again, one major war beginning in 1768 ended with Russian victories that opened up strategic access and influence. By 1774, Russia seized territory including the cities of Azov and Kerch. And from there, the empire moved into the Caucasus, the northeastern Balkans, and eventually the Crimean Peninsula. Meanwhile, Catherine expanded Russia westward through one of Europe's most dramatic political collapses, the decline of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Over the course of three partitions, 1772, 1793, 1795, Poland was effectively divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Russia acquired vast territory, most of Ukraine, nearly all of Belarus, Lithuania, and parts of eastern Poland. With that, Russia became not only enormous, but unstoppable. Napoleon learns the size of Russia the hard way. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia with one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. But Russia had something Napoleon could not defeat: distance and winter. The Russians retreated, refusing decisive battle until deep in the interior, while supply lines collapsed. And then came the cold. The Grande Armée disintegrated. It remains one of history's most famous reminders that Russia's greatest defensive weapon isn't always its army. It is its geography. By 1815, Russia emerged victorious and gained further control over parts of Poland, and Finland became a semi-independent Grand Duchy under Russian rule. The great game, Russia versus Britain. By the mid-19th century, Russia reached the height of its geopolitical influence. Across Europe, there was a genuine fear that Russia's expansion would swallow everything in its path. Britain, in particular, watched nervously, because Russia began pushing into Central Asia toward regions Britain viewed as dangerously close to its crown jewel, India. This intense rivalry became known as the Great Game. Both powers competed for influence and control over Afghanistan and Persia, buffer regions between their empires. Russia secured control over Central Asian territories, including regions around modern-day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan. But Afghanistan remained fiercely independent, resisting full conquest despite repeated efforts by empires. Vladivostok in the Far East. In the Far East, Russia gained concessions from China in the 1860s, founding Vladivostok in 1861, its only major ice-free port on the Pacific. Its name means, in essence, rule the East, a name that tells you everything about Russia's mindset. But only a few years later, Russia made a decision that would later seem almost unbelievable. Sale of Alaska. In 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, roughly equivalent to about $150 million today. At the time, many Americans mocked the purchase, calling it Seward's folly, believing it was worthless frozen land. But history would prove otherwise. Alaska contained oil, gold, and immense strategic value. Russia, however, had feared that if war broke out with Britain again, it would lose Alaska anyway, especially with British Canada nearby. So it sold the territory rather than risk losing it for nothing. Revolution and the Soviet Empire. Despite its size, Russia remained economically behind Western Europe. Its autocratic system bred unrest, and political movements like socialism, anarchism, and communism grew stronger. Then came disaster, World War I. Russia's war effort collapsed under pressure, and in 1917, revolution erupted. By the end of that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in major cities including St. Petersburg and Moscow. A civil war followed between the Bolsheviks, Reds, and their opponents, Whites. By 1923, the Reds won, and from the ashes emerged the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Some territories broke away. Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states re-emerged as independent nations. But the Soviet Union retained the vast majority of the former empire. World War II and Soviet expansion. In 1939, the Second World War began, and the Soviet Union endured some of the most devastating losses of any nation in human history. But as German forces retreated in 1943 and beyond, Soviet armies swept into Eastern Europe. After the war, Soviet influence expanded massively. Baltic states were absorbed directly as Soviet republics. Communist governments emerged across Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and more. The Soviet Union became a superpower, not only by territory but by ideology, influence, and military reach. Cold War and a global reach. Though the USSR did not expand much in official borders after World War II, Soviet influence spread worldwide through alliances, proxy wars, and political support. From Cuba to Vietnam, from North Korea to Afghanistan, Soviet-backed movements reshaped the global map. Yet behind the propaganda of prosperity, the USSR struggled. By the 1970s and 1980s, it fell behind the West economically and technologically, unable to innovate at the pace of the United States and its allies. Even attempts at reform under Mikhail Gorbachev could not reverse the momentum. The Soviet structure began to fracture, and then suddenly it collapsed. The dissolution of the USSR. In 1990 and 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. One by one, the republics declared independence. Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova. And finally, what remained became the modern-day Russian Federation. Even reduced from its Soviet height, Russia remained the largest country on Earth by an enormous margin. A nation stretching from Europe to the Pacific, holding centuries of conquest, trauma, identity, ambition, and survival within its borders. Russia is not simply big because it is big. It is big because history made it so. Through steppe warfare, Viking trade routes, Mongol domination, imperial ambition, frozen frontiers, and modern superpower struggle, Russia expanded outward until it touched the edge of the world. And even today, as the nation continues to evolve, one fact remains undeniable. No country on Earth occupies the map quite like Russia.